This is Justin Ford for From the Frontline. Tonight we're dealing with South Sudan celebrates its 13th anniversary of successful struggle for secession. In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Today, on the 9th of July 2024, we mark a monumental answer to prayer as South Sudan, or the South Sudanese, celebrate the 13th anniversary of their successful struggle for self-determination and secession from the Arab North. This is quite a milestone, and Dr. Hammond, you had quite a lot to do with this movement for the secession of South Sudan. What was the situation when Frontline Fellowship began its work in Sudan 29 years ago?
Well, almost unrecognizable from today. It was a closed country, a terrible civil war, scorched earth, jihad, bombing of civilian centers, hospitals, schools, villages, marketplaces, terror campaign targeting civilians, widespread starvation because of the scorched earth, devastation, no schools operational, no working hospitals, obviously no Bible colleges working, very few churches operational, a lot of despair. It was a no-fly zone, it was a no-go area. It was so bad that when I started to inquire about going into Sudan, I went to meet the head of Sudan Interior Mission, SIM, in Nairobi, in neighboring Kenya, and he said, it is impossible to work in South Sudan. And I said, please explain to me. He said, with a human being you can reason, but you cannot reason with the South Sudanese. I mean, this is the Sudan Interior Mission, a Christian missionary CEO speaking to me. Impossible to work there. I had so many people, not in such extreme ways, saying it's impossible, it's a closed country, it's absolute chaos over there, everybody is killing everybody and all sorts of things like that. Situation was very dire and desperate.
What led you to focus so much time and attention on Sudan, Dr. Hammond?
Well, first of all, it was the time, the opportunity and the need. So it was the end of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain had come down, 1989. Berlin Wall had collapsed. The whole of the Eastern Europe was now open up for the gospel. The Soviet Union had been defeated in Africa. It was the end of the war in Angola, end of the war in Mozambique. Because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War being over, the Cuban troops were withdrawing back to Cuba, and so the war was over in Southern Africa. Southwest Africa, Mozambique, Angola all suddenly had their first multi-party elections. And the wars were over. So as a mission to war zones, helping persecute churches, there was a new opportunity. And I'd heard about this terrible persecution in Sudan. Funnily enough, at a missions conference in Europe, I was in Frankfurt, Germany, and I heard about what was going on in Sudan from Sudanese refugees there. And I thought, I'm well connected. I'm on lots of mailing lists. I'm well aware of what's going on amongst persecuted church. Why have I never heard about the persecution in Sudan before? And this war in Sudan. And so I knew I had to go there, and there was this opportunity because all our mission fields in Southern and Central Africa had suddenly opened up. And so other ministries were pouring in where now it was legal and safe and easy to cross the border. And so we had new opportunity. And actually another thing that led me to Sudan was the Holocaust in Rwanda exploded in 1994. And so I went there, and while doing primary research for what ended up being Holocaust in Rwanda book and delivering hundreds of Bibles into Rwanda, including to the Interahamwe mass murderers who were awaiting trial and death sentence in the prisons in Kigali. I was close enough to Sudan to hitchhike a ride, because I didn't have a vehicle, into Sudan, and I managed to get into eastern Equatoria, and I managed to see some of what was being done. Bombs all over towns, massive destruction, bombed churches and schools, and speak to some of the crippled people who had suffered from this. Also visited some of the Sudanese war wounded in a Red Cross hospital in neighboring Kenya in Lokachokia. And so I then realized this is where we've got to refocus our mission's attention for the next many years. Because here's the largest country in Africa, Sudan, involved in the longest war in African history, been raging since 1955. The most severe persecution Christians were suffering anywhere that I could see, anywhere in the continent, maybe the world at that time. And also, Sudan was very strategic in terms of the 1040 window and the Muslim world. So if you think of the world's great mission fields, missionary shorthand for the most needy areas in the world is 1040 window. That means from the 10th to the 40th degree latitude in the northern hemisphere, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean across North Africa, the Middle East, South Central Asia, ending up in the Pacific. In that 1040 window are more than 3 billion people on the planet. Well, it's more like 4 billion now, but there were 3 billion then. And most of the unreached people in the world were in the 1040 window. The least amount of missionaries, the most amount of persecution, the least amount of freedom, the highest level of suffering in the world was all crammed into the 1040 window. Stretching from Morocco, Algeria, across Libya and Egypt, through to the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, all the way through to Vietnam and China. And of course, Sudan was Muslim North, Christian South, so it's like at the crossroads between Africa and the Middle East, or the Muslim Arab world. Arab North, Black Christian South. So I saw this as strategic. If we can win people in South Sudan to Christ and train and equip them, they could help evangelize Muslims in the North, because think of the strategicness of this from a Muslim evangelism point of view. You've got many people in Sudan who are Christians, who know Arabic language and the Arabic culture, and they're in the Middle East, they understand a lot of the culture there. So how much easier to train people who really speak Arabic and who live in the Muslim world, many of whom were brought up in Muslim schools and so on, and many who had actually been converted from Islam recently, and train them to fulfill the Great Commission in the Middle East. So I saw good strategic reasons. There was tremendous need. It was a very neglected area. And in fact, when I first went to Sudan, the people said, we are a hidden people fighting a forgotten war. And I think that's a pretty good description, so much so that on the back cover of my book, Faith Under Fire in Sudan, I entitled the back cover, Africa's Forgotten War. And it was really a forgotten war at that stage. You couldn't find pictures, let alone articles, on what was going on in Sudan. It was like a black hole, an absolute dead area. The media didn't talk about it. You never saw visuals. And of course, journalists wouldn't want to go to such a dangerous and uncomfortable country. So the media just wasn't reporting on it. So I thought, this is super strategic, very important, very neglected. And the whole purpose of the existence of Frontline Fellowship was restricted access areas, which it was, war zones, ministering in conflict areas, helping people where most people think it's too dangerous or too difficult to go. So Sudan matched all of our goals and strategic focus. And there was a need, there was an opportunity, and no one else was doing anything in Sudan at that stage.
Why do you advocate self-determination, secession and independence for South Sudan?
Well, having ministered in Eastern Europe shortly before, I'd witnessed how secessions brought freedom to Croatia and Slovenia, which broke away from Yugoslavia, and Slovakia, which broke away from the Czechoslovakian country, the creation of the Versailles Treaty, and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic states that had broken away from the Soviet Union. So having seen how secession and self-determination brought about freedom for these countries in Europe, it seemed natural to me that one of the key solutions for South Sudan would be if we could redraw the map so that the south of Sudan, where black Christians are the majority, could break away from the Arab north, where Muslims are the majority. Now, Sudan's a big country. There's over 30 million people there right now. And while there were only about 7 million in the south, the ones in the south were mostly black Christians and some animist. And the north, though, outnumbered them. So the black Christians in South Sudan were a minority in their own country. If you could redraw the map and break the southern part away from Sudan, then the southerners would be a majority in their own country, and you would have black Christians ruling black Christians, free from the Sharia law of the north. So it seemed fairly obvious to me, knowing the history and the cultural realities and the missionary perspective, that this was a solution. Although nobody in Sudan seemed to have thought of that at that stage. They were just hoping for autonomy in the south.
Were the South Sudanese planning for secession and independence?
Not at all. In fact, I was amazed that even the founder and leader of the SPLA, the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, Colonel John Garang, he said to me, it's not possible. When I spoke about independence, he said, all we can hope for is secession, is autonomy. We're fighting for autonomy in a free, unified Sudan. And actually, he had some national aspirations. He was hoping he could win the war and rule from Khartoum over the whole of Sudan. But nevertheless, his second commander, Salva Kiir, liked the idea, but he said it'll never happen because the African Union is locked into the Berlin Conference of 1885 boundaries, which, if you've looked at the map, you can see some parts of the map are obviously drawn with a ruler. It's a straight line, latitudes and longitudes. And obviously, when they drew up the Berlin Conference in 1885, dividing up Africa between the different European powers responsible to end slavery and to bring about some levels of improvement for the people's lives. And they were, of course, thinking in terms of you've got to protect Africa from being exploited by Japan, China, Russia, even the United States of America, which was growing as an economic power. So the Europeans started out saying this was to end slavery in Africa and, fight for human rights. It was liberals back in the 1880s were, you've got to get into Africa and you've got to make protectorates of these countries and stop the people killing and eating one another, stop the slave trade. And so, interesting, a liberal in the 1880s would have supported the colonialization or protectorates in Africa, whereas today they now think it's one of the worst crimes in history. Not that the people at the time saw it that way, but they obviously didn't have an African present. The only person who knew anything about Africa present there was Henry Morton Stanley, and he was there as a journalist, and they weren't seeking his advice, but they were making rivers a boundary. But the thing is, most people live on both sides of a river. Like, you can't make the Thames a boundary of a country because English people live on both sides of the Thames. The Danube flows through Germany. It's not its boundary. Same with Austria and so on. So to suddenly make a river boundary is not intelligent. So you just think of how the Avambo people half live in Angola, half live in Namibia. The ones in Angola speak Portuguese, the ones in Namibia speak Afrikaans, or some of them may be English. And the ones in North drive on the right-hand side of the road, and the ones in Namibia drive on the left-hand side of the road. And then two different time zones. And same with the Shangaan people or Tonga people. Half live in Mozambique, half live in South Africa. And then you've got, of course, Tswana people living in Northern Cape and also in Botswana. And so all over Africa, we've got strange things like this. Like the Chichewa people. They live in Malawi, but many Chichewa people are in Zambia and many are also in Mozambique. And so, you could just think in Asia how you've got the Kurds, who should be their own country. They're a big nation, 80 million people. But Winston Churchill, who redrew the map of the Middle East after the First World War, divided up the Kurds between northern Iraq and northwestern Iran and eastern Turkey. And so, whereas Kurdistan should be its own country, they're being oppressed by three different countries, and I mean oppressed, as in gas warfare, terror bombings. The Kurds are really being hammered, and it's because the map did not recognize the demographic realities. So I looked at this and said, you have to redraw the map in Sudan, where the Black South has its own independent country, where you can be a majority in your own country, not a minority in the Arab Sharia-controlled North. And Salva Kiir said, but it'll never happen because the African Union has never approved a redrawing of the map. And when I said, well, what about Eritrea breaking away from Ethiopia? He said, no, that's different because Eritrea always was its own separate country. It's only at the end of the Second World War that the British decided to punish the Italians by taking away the Italian-controlled Eritrea and forcing it into the Abyssinia, which now became called Ethiopia. And so all Eritrea's independence did was re-establish the boundaries of the 1885 Berlin Conference. So we had lots of interesting discussions there, and Commander Salva Kiir was adamant, it's a good idea, Peter, he said, but it'll never happen. The African Union will never allow it. They don't want to redraw the map because all the countries in Africa could break up then, because so many of the wars in Africa have been caused by demographic realities being ignored by the Berlin Conference, like the Biafran Civil War, when the Igbos of Nigeria tried to fight for independence from the Muslim Arab North, the Hausa in the north. And sadly, that was crushed. And that was pretty bad because with the Biafran Civil War, millions died, by the way. And you had the United States of America, Soviet Union, and Red China working together with the United States to support the Muslim North and crushing the Christian South. And only France, Portugal, and South Africa gave support to the Biafran Christian South. And only South Africa sent troops up to Biafra to help them. A company of parabats were led by Captain Jan Breitenbach, who recently passed away, and he led a South African team of paratroopers to particularly train and aid the Ibus in Biafra. He was on the last plane out, which is immortalized in the opening scenes of the Dogs of War film, which was inspired by how he flew out of Uli, the last Dakota out, with everything exploding around and under fire. And the South Africans were the last plane out of Uli at the end of the Biafran Civil War. But that's just to say that that's the way the South Sudanese were thinking. It's not possible. We can never redraw the map. It'll never be accepted. The African Union is against it. They're hostile. So most of the people were pretty discouraged and felt there was nothing for it but to hope for autonomy where the South can rule the South. Because when the Muslim Arab North took over, when the British left, of the 800 officials ruling South Sudan, 798 were Arabs, Muslims, and only 2 were South Sudanese. So as the South Sudanese said, this is the last war of decolonization in Africa, because they were a colonial construct and they were being colonized by the Arab North. Imagine 800 officials in South Sudan and only 2 of them were actually South Sudanese, the rest were Arabs from the north. And so the people in South Sudan felt fairly hopeless.
How did you campaign for independence of South Sudan?
Well, there's 2 aspects. There's the internal in South Sudan and there's the external internationally. So internally, I had to get the South Sudanese to believe in themselves and to understand the lessons of history, that they would always be a persecuted Christian minority in a majority Muslim Arab North, unless they redrew the map, to have them believe in themselves that they could be an independent country and they could rule themselves. And so I initiated the Chaplains Corps of South Sudan. Now, the SPLA, when it started, was actually a pretty Marxist-oriented country. They were a revolutionary movement supported by Mengistu's Ethiopia, and so they had commissars originally. Well, by God's grace, we quickly got rid of all the commissars, no more red stars or anything like that, and brought in Chaplains Corps. In fact, my wife sewed on the first chaplain's badges on chaplain's berets, and I carried in the first chaplain's handbooks and trained them, and my wife also did the first medical corps, literally sewed together the armbands, and unfortunately she modeled it on me. And so when we put them on the Sudanese, who were like stick creatures, they didn't eat as well as us, these armbands just fell off, so we actually had to fold them over and stitch them again, because their arms weren't full enough to accommodate these armbands as they'd been designed. But we took in the first medic packs and trained them. I actually did some of the first training of the medics, bleeding, breeding, breakages and burns. I'm not a medical, but I'd learned a few things in the fire brigade and army. And then we brought in nurses and doctors who gave them proper training in first aid. And we did all kinds of leadership training. I ran garden government seminars for mayors and town councillors and the political leaders, and also for the army leaders. We did all kinds of biblical worldview seminars, and it was very helpful. We took in lots of Bibles and books and films and tried to broaden their minds to understand what was going on, to understand what's at stake and how they could work for full independence and secession. Now, externally, I wrote the book Faith Under Fire in Sudan, which went through 3 editions. The first edition got a death threat fatwa from the Sudan government. So I thought, well, that's obviously a vote of confidence. So we brought out a second edition, which was double the size, and then a third edition, which was 3 times the size, Faith Under Fire in Sudan, which really, they were such bestsellers. They moved very fast all over the world. And so the book was key for getting people to see the whole picture of Sudan in the Bible. There's a lot of prophecies in the Bible about Sudan. To see Sudan's history, to understand some of the teachings of jihad and why they were being hammered and they're suffering, in some cases, a genocidal attack against them. The Muslim Arab North said, we don't need the people, we just want the land, which was that bad. And so to expose what they were fighting for and why, and give examples of excellence to inspire the people, and to get more international support, the book was key. Then we brought in film producers like Pat Matriciano, who helped produce Terrorism and Persecution in Sudan Led in the Holocaust, which got wide showings around the world and was even shown on James Kennedy's Truths That Transform in Coleridge Hour. So millions of Americans saw those films, and we managed to get a lot more support. So it was lots of public meetings, lots of radio programs, TV programs, I calculate that I did about 1,200 services and meetings inside Sudan and 1,000 radio, TV and public meetings outside of Sudan, campaigning for South Sudan's independence and mobilizing support for them.
What kind of responses did you receive, Dr. Hammond?
Well, to be honest, originally a surprise, astonishment and skepticism. One example would be Samaritan's Purse. Now, I was motivated and asked by the Sudanese people, can you please bring people who can help establish hospitals here? And when I asked them, what do you need? How can we help you? Their first request were Bibles and Bible teaching. Well, that's within Frontline's scope. But when the next request was hospitals, we need hospitals, we need doctors. Well, a man's got to know his limitations, and we're not a medical mission, but we've got friends and contacts. And the first person I thought of when it came to medical help was Samaritan's Purse and Franklin Graham. And I'd seen their work in Rwanda. When I'd gone to Rwanda just the year before, I noticed that in Rwanda, when the war broke out, when the massacres and the Holocaust broke out, there was no medical people there, not the Red Cross, not Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, none of them were there. And the only medical group left in Rwanda during the Holocaust was Samaritan's Purse. And when I visited, they were donning Wellington boots and plunging into the gutter system of Kigali Hospital to pull out the dead bodies and break up the congealed blood, which was preventing the drainage system from working so that they could get this hospital operational again. And there were plagues of rats. I mean, rats the size of cats. And at night, we would wake up to the ladies in the Samaritan's Purse barracks screaming because rats were climbing in. And I remember one particular woman, she was absolutely paranoid about rats. So she chose the top bunk bed. She thought the higher off the ground she was, the safer she was. Actually, as the rats tend to come in from the roof, she had the rats first. So she woke up middle of the night screaming because rats were climbing on top of her. It doesn't help being in a top bunk when rats live on the roof. And, you'd have these rat traps all over the place. And when a rat trap would slam shut at night, you'd hear a chair throughout the whole bungalow or barracks where we were staying. And I knew Samaritan's Purse were the people who could do the job. So I wrote to Franklin Graham and in North Carolina, and I got back very busy, overcommitted, not possible. So then I heard Franklin Graham's coming to Cape Town to have an evangelistic crusade in Newlands Cricket Grounds, which is, my father used to run Newlands Cricket Grounds. He was head of the Cricket Union of South Africa, Western Province Cricket Union. So I knew the place well, and I thought, this is great, he's coming to my town. So I wrote asking for an appointment when he's in Cape Town. Sorry, program's fully booked and all that. So I'm thinking, no, he can't be coming to Cape Town for no reason. This must be God's provision. The timing, just perfect. So I'm wondering about this, praying about this, and I sit down at my desk, and Lenora puts a pile of letters on my desk that she'd just gotten from the post office, and included a gilt embossed envelope looking very smart from the Mayor of Cape Town. Open it up, and lo and behold, I've got a gilt card invitation to attend a prayer breakfast at City Hall where the guest speaker will be Franklin Graham. Well, how's that for answered prayer? So I made sure I got there early. I was a motorbike at that time, so I parked my bike as motorbikers can, almost anywhere, very close to the door, and walked in with my helmet over my arm. And Franklin Graham and the mayor were standing at the door, and nobody was there yet, and I was first in the queue. Good morning, Franklin Graham, I said. I believe you're also a motorbiker. And he smiled broadly. Yes, indeed, he says. I drive a Harley Davidson, and actually I'm just doing Honda, off-road XL though. But he didn't hold that against me. I said, Mr. Graham, I believe you've also worked amongst resistance fighters of the Contras in Nicaragua. And he said, yes. And I said, I've also been working amongst chaplains of the Renamo's freedom fighters in Mozambique and UNITA freedom fighters in Angola. And I said, Mr. Graham, I've got one question for you. Why is Samaritan's Purse not in Sudan? And he said, we have been in Sudan. And I mentioned, yes, in Upper Nile and Blue Nile. But I said, you were working for Riek Mashar's crowd. He's a surrogate for the government. And he said, I didn't know that. Now, they'd had a very bad experience in Sudan, I know, and that's why they left. but they were with surrogates for the Arabs. They were with the Nuer SSIM of Riek Machar, who's a complete criminal, and he had done all kinds of evil things. In fact, it said that Riek Machar's SSIM killed more civilians and wiped out more cattle, did more scorched earth than even the Arab North did. And he was a surrogate for the Arab North, and he was being armed and trained and supplied by them. He also sabotaged a lot of the independence afterwards by being the most corrupt minister in the government of national unity put together by Salva Kiir. And Salva Kiir only included him under the influence and pressure and bullying of President Jimmy Carter, the American president who's probably one of the worst presidents America ever had. But since he became president, since getting voted out of office, he's been wandering around the world interfering for the United Nations and giving very bad advice, such as telling Salva Kiir, no, you mustn't have prayer, you can't have Christian national anthem, you can't have prayer in Parliament, you've got to be a secular state. And this is this born-again Baptist Sunday school teacher from Georgia who's encouraging people not to be Christian. I mean, can you imagine? Well, anyway, so I said to Franklin Graham, I know just a place where you can open up a hospital, an excellent place in South Sudan. And at this point, people were gathering and there's a queue building up behind me. So he said, I'll have to speak to you later. And I went inside. And then later on, he came along with his Ken Isaacs, who is his operations man. And he said, please explain to Ken your project. So I explained to him. And at first, Ken Isaacs is leaning backwards, arms folded, legs crossed, looking very detached, disinterested, and skeptical, which is a normal first response. But as I spoke and showed him maps and pictures, he started to lean forward, and you could see he's getting engrossed by this. And just a day later, he phones me and said, Franklin Graham's given the green light. Take us into South Sudan tomorrow. And I said, I need a bit of warning. I've got schedules. He said, Peter, you've got a green light. Drive through the intersection. So, okay, well, let's just scrap my plans for the next month. And I flew up to Kenya the next day and took them into South Sudan the following day. And he was fairly skeptical, so I was, giving inspirational stories. And so I was telling him about Kenneth Fraser, the first missionary to the area of South Sudan where we were going into an Equatoria, and how he had such an impact amongst the people and had such discipline, plant the first school, the first church, the first hospitals. And I said, you could leave your wallet on the main road next to the marketplace and somebody would bring it to you, nothing would be missing. And he was looking awfully skeptical about this, and they started to make a joke about it. And one day we're in Moreland in Kotobi, and as we were driving out, I was taking them to Loy to show them the hospital which had been abandoned, which we could, and actually was now riddled with mines, but we'd have to clear that for them to be able to use, to show them where I was planning for them to establish their first hospital. And so on the way, this Ken Isaac says to me, Peter, do you really believe that rubbish about you could leave your wallet on the main road and someone would bring it to you? I said, yes. So he said, give me your wallet now. And all the Americans in the vehicle were laughing, and I hand over my wallet, and it's not like there was much money in it. There's an ID card and things like this. There was a little bit of money, but not much. And I didn't have much in my accounts anyway, but as he threw the wallet out the window, landed plop on the dirt road opposite the marketplace, everyone was laughing, and I felt sick to my stomach because so much was hanging on this. What if some person from another village or tribe is coming past? I know you could trust the moral Christians, but I wasn't too sure about all the others. And so they were laughing, and all that day I was praying, showing them around, but just that these people would not be discouraged, that they would hear the testimony that this wallet would not be missing. So we got back that night, nothing, but the next morning was Sunday morning, and I was preparing for church, sort of just doing up my tie, and along came Canon Reuben, and he is one of the older leaders at the church. He had in fact fired some of the first shots of the war. He is part of the Equatorial Corps, which when the Arabs came and said, you must hand over your rifles and get in a train to go to the north. And they said, no, we know you Arabs, and you've always treated us as slaves, and we're the defenders of the South. We're not going to give up our weapons. And that's where the war started, Anania 1, as they called it. So Ken Reuben came up to me, two young boys, and he says, is this your wallet? These young boys found it outside the marketplace. And I just had to look out the corner of my eye, and there was Ken Isaacs and the other Americans standing, and their mouths were wide open. And I opened up the wallet, and I'm sure they could tell it's my wallet. I mean, there's my picture in there, the ID card, and there was nothing missing that I could see. And I looked at them, and they just were jaws dropping. They were absolutely stunned. And at that point, the whole attitude changed. I realized this is a place to come. And so I think that's what people have found about South Sudan. When I would speak about it first, people would be very skeptical, very disinterested. And when they start to hear the testimonies, like me talking about the church that had been bombed 18 times in a 12-month period, and I went to encourage them, and not only was the church packed, but the church was overflowing, and people literally sitting around the church listening through the windows. And the evangelist, who didn't have any feet, the Arabs had cut off his feet, axed it off, and there he was riding on a donkey or walking on his knees to evangelize his neighbors. I mean, the Bible says how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news. This brother had no feet, but he wasn't letting the inconvenience of not having feet keep him from evangelizing. And I think testimonies like these, and the stories are related in the Faith Undefined Sudan book and in some of these films and in church services, started to get people inspired and encouraged, and to really see South Sudan is a place of destiny. There's these prophecies in the Bible. Cush will submit herself to God. Beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, it's tall people, smooth-skinned people of strange speech will bring offerings to the Lord, and the sacrifices spoken of in Zephaniah. And there's just so much in the Bible speaking about Sudan, and to realize this is a biblical nation with many prophecies, and there's a strong Christian foundation here in the south of Sudan and the Nuba Mountains. And so I'd find the initial skepticism turning over time to real inspiration and excitement. And so people's attitudes did change over the years. And the South Sudanese also went from despair to actually having a vision and hope for the future. You know, without a vision, a people perish. And as the people of Sudan got a vision of freedom and of independence, it really changed everything.
Given that Sudan was run by a totalitarian dictatorship, how did the independence of Sudan actually come about?
Well, I think you can say two words: prayer and pressure. Luke 17 says, even an unjust judge will do what is right in response to prayer and pressure. And the Lord Jesus gave an example saying we must always pray and not give up. And he gave the example of the widow who prayed and interceded with the magistrate. And although the magistrate did not fear God or care about men, in the end, the wicked magistrate did what was right because of the prayer and the pressure of this persistent widow and her prayers. So God listens to prayer. Governments only respond to pressure. First time I heard Ronald Reagan, he said that the most dangerous words in English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. And he says, politicians never see the light until they feel the heat. Keep the heat up on the people in Washington. And that's good advice. So we pray to God and we mobilize the population to put pressure on the politicians. And then I also knew the great story of 7-year Jericho Prayer March. We were part of that. I used to work at Hospital Christian Fellowship, my first mission, and Brother Andrew came there as a guest speaker a number of times, and on one occasion he gave us the vision of the 7-year Jericho Prayer March. He said it's already started. The Christians in Eastern Europe are focusing the next 7 years to pray for the collapse of communism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, coming down the Berlin Wall, opening up the Iron Curtain, to bring freedom and openness to the gospel throughout Eastern Europe and Russia. Well, I thought that's a bridge too far, but I joined the movement, and amazingly, 7 years later, 1989, things started to happen. The Berlin Wall collapsed. Hungary opened up for the gospel. Czechoslovakia, most stunningly Romania, where this Antichrist Ceausescu dictator was shot by his own army, the Christmas Revolution. And so many free countries came about as a result of that. So looking at that, I thought we need to mobilize a prayer movement worldwide and within Sudan to bring down the Arab governments of Sudan and to pray for friends to rise up all over the world to intercede and, like the persistent widow, to pray to the Lord and to pressure the politicians until South Sudan could be free and allowed to choose self-determination and independence if they wished.
What lessons can be learned by those interested in self-determination and secession?
I think there's a lot of lessons to learn. In one way, I would say the book of Nehemiah really shows us how to go about it, because that was a bit of a model for us. Nehemiah faced a terrible dilemma. Jerusalem was destroyed, the gates were destroyed with fire, the walls were broken down. And so the first thing Nehemiah did to rectify the situation was he gathered information. And then he mobilized intercession. And then he mobilized involvement and finally implemented his plan. And you can see in just a few days, something like 52 days, he was able to turn the rubble around Jerusalem into a solid wall and restore the gates. And so Operation Nehemiah, I think. So if you consider some of these statistics that they use in military intelligence, 5% of people make things happen. 15% of people watch things happen. 80% of people don't have a clue what happened. 5% of people think, 15% think they think, and 80% never think. And so on this basis, they said, you need to mobilize, the 5% need books. They need seminars, conferences, documentation. The 15%, some leaflets and some video clips will do fine. The 80%, you're down to sound bites, bumper stickers, slogans, and you just think any great movement, whether it's the Reformation or America's War of Independence, you need the books, the documentation to mobilize the thinkers and the people who are the movers and shakers and make things happen. But then you need leaflets for the vast majority, and then you need slogans. I mean, like, give me liberty or give me death, no taxation without representation, or the battle cries of the Reformation. Scripture alone is the ultimate authority, the five solas really. Salvation is by the grace of God alone, received by faith alone. Christ alone is the head of the church. Soli Deo Gloria, everything must be done to the glory of God alone. So you start with books, but you've got to go through leaflets. You must end up with bumper stickers and slogans, sound bites as well. And so mobilizing any movement requires you to especially focus on the people who make things happen and the thinkers, but you can't neglect the sound bites and the slogans to mobilize the vast majority of people and who don't have time for books. So I think the first thing is, for good secession movements, you've got to have a core of well-motivated, well-instructed people who understand the history, understand the dynamics, what's involved, and then you've got to move a mass movement. And we did this by multiple means. We produced the books like Faith Under Fire in Sudan. We used films and videos like Sudan, the Holocaust, Terrorism, Persecution. We did lots of public meetings, lots of radio, lots of TV. And we mobilized movements within Sudan. We mobilized friends from outside Sudan. And through prayer and pressure, ultimately, we were able to see the struggle for Sudan move beyond information and intercession to involvement and implementation. I think people can really learn by reading books like Faith Under Fire in Sudan and The Case for Secession to see how secession movements succeeded across Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, in Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, all these movements in the past, and of course most recently South Sudan.
What resources are available for those who want to learn more about the long struggle for faith and freedom in South Sudan?
Well, the full story is given in the Faith Under Fire in Sudan book, which is over 300 pages and over 300 pictures, and it's a well-illustrated full story on Sudan, historically, biblically, prophecy-wise, contemporary, the war, all the way down to practical movements, through to the independence of South Sudan. So it's very up-to-date, right through to 2011. And then there's the Frontline Behind Enemy Lines for Christ book, where I give Frontline's history, and it has a lot on Sudan because that was a major part of our missions work in the last 40 years. And I personally did 27 missions to Sudan. I took in over 600,000 Bibles and Christian books into Sudan in about 24 languages into 14 different regions. And so there's a lot that we can learn about Sudan from the books, Faith Under Fire in Sudan, Frontline Behind Enemy Lines for Christ, which are also available as ebooks and print on demands. And then the videos, Sudan, the Holocaust, Terrorism, Persecution, those help. Supplementary-wise, also Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, Historical Roots and Contemporary Threats, another book I wrote, which has gone through 3 editions, and it's been a bestseller. And in fact, Amazon was selling copies of them for $100 and then $1,000 a copy, where we only were selling for $10 and then the 3rd edition for $15. So it was so much in demand we couldn't print them fast enough. And those you can also visit www.frontlinemissionsa.org, and you'll find a lot of articles on Sudan, posters, pictures, links to audio and video, including presentations on Sudan and how independence for South Sudan was won. There's a lot of that available on sermon audio too, if you just want the audio lectures. So frontlinemissionsa.org.
What is the situation in South Sudan and in the Nuba Mountains today, Dr. Hammond?
Well, in a word, volatile. Interestingly, the civil war in the south has ended, but there's now civil war in the north, which is a bit of a proxy war between Russia and America, because the North Sudanese government, well, it's just called the Sudan government, but it's now 2/3 the size of what used to be before South Sudan broke away in what is now called South Sudan. But the government of Sudan put a treaty with Russia that would enable Russia to set up a naval base on the Red Sea at a port in South Sudan, in northern Sudan. And at this point, a group that was obviously sponsored or supported by the United States started a civil war. So you've got a more pro-Russian and a pro-American, two sides fighting one another. So it's a proxy war. But fortunately, because the North is busy fighting itself, it means they're leaving the South alone, which is a relief at the moment. So we've got a window of opportunity, and we've used this window of opportunity to take in vastly more Bibles and books and audio Bibles, and to encourage medical teams like Doctors for Life to go into the Nuba Mountains and literally help the blind to see through cataract surgery. There have been many hundreds of patients dealt with every year by Doctors for Life volunteers. There's been missions who've gone and built schools and churches and gone in and built these boreholes. There's a lot of great things that have happened during the window of opportunity. The government of Sudan, the ones that did all the persecution, Omar al-Bashir's National Islamic Front got toppled in a revolution, and they were kicked out of power. And that was 2019. There was a march of the millions protesting, brought Khartoum to a standstill, and they had a return to civilian rule, although now the military have taken over again, and it's a bit of a civil war in North. But there's been a lot of changes, and interestingly, Omar al-Bashir was placed on trial for corruption and genocide, and he's wanted for genocide by the International Criminal Court, and it's going to remain to be seen if he gets extradited to the Netherlands for standing trial for that. But right now, there's been a big change in the North, and the North is in a civil war. It's actually quite a bad civil war, including jet aircraft bombing civilian centers in the middle of Khartoum, the capital. So in a sense, it's what they've sown is what they're reaping, and the situation is quite severe. So we really should pray for the people in Sudan, the Christians in Sudan in particular, and pray that through this horrible civil war north of Sudan, that many Muslims will come to Christ as well.
How can we pray for them effectively and support the Christians in Sudan?
Well, get more information, and you'll get a prayer post also, and pray for Sudan, pray for South Sudan, pray for the Muslim world, pray for the Nuba Mountains. These prayer posters are on the frontlinemissionsa.org website. You could put up at your church. There's videos that you can show to your church, including on missions to the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. And we've got some International Day of Prayer videos and events coming up. On the second Sunday of November every year, we try to mobilize Christians around the world to focus on praying for the persecuted church. That's far enough ahead. Hopefully, you can persuade your church or school to put aside the second Sunday of November, the 10th of November, for an International Day of Prayer for the persecuted church. Let's mobilize prayer from, I think, our prayer groups, our church Sunday school groups, our Bible study groups. Let's mobilize for prayer and action to support the persecuted. That's seriously important. We're told to remember the persecuted.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hammond, for enlightening us about the obscure situation in Sudan and South Sudan. Listeners, please continue to pray for the Christians in South Sudan and for ongoing mission projects in the Nuba Mountains of South Kordofan. In closing, I'd like to read 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 to 2. Finally, brethren, pray for us that the word of the Lord may run swiftly and be glorified, just as it is with you, and that we may be delivered from unreasonable and wicked men, for not all have faith. Thank you very much for joining us for From the Frontline. God bless and good night.